welcome to this session. We are very happy to have you all here. And before introducing our guest speaker, I would like to thank IEMed for hosting us. My name is Juan Carlos Triviño. I'm research fellow at GRITIM, the Interdisciplinary Group of Migration Studies at the Pompeu Fabra University. And today I have the pleasure to introduce you Gerard Delante, and we would like to thank him for accepting our invitation to speak to us today. Before giving the floor to our speaker, let me say a few words about him. Gerard is Emeritus Professor at Sussex University, which he joined in 2007 as Professor of Sociology and Social and Political Thought. Previously, from 1996, he had been Professor of Sociology at the University of Liverpool. He obtained his PhD in 1988 from the National University of Ireland, and he was a visiting professor at York University, Toronto, Toshima University, Kyoto, among others. His specialist field is social and political theory, as well as the history and philosophy of the social science. He has also published widely on many topics in political sociology, and he has also, and Gerard Delante is the author of 15 books and editor of 13, and over 60 journal articles, as well as more than 80 chapters in collections. So with this said, I would like to welcome you to IEMed and to this space. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Juan Carlos, for your introduction, and yeah, I'm delighted to speak at this institute and on this topic. I'm not a migration scholar as such. However, migration is something that pervades everything. Virtually all social phenomena are in some way connected with migration. And well, over the last 5 years, I have become interested in, as you know, social scientists everywhere with climate change. And well, I was asked to give a talk on the topic of migration, so I decided it was time to address this this whole question of climate change and in relation to migration, and in particular the specter of so-called climate migration. And well, my aim is to offer a sociological interpretation of this contested connection between climate change and migration. And well, I was asked to try to pose the topic I'm talking about in terms of a debate. So let me raise a question or two for debate before I go to the substance of my talk. So the question I would ask, maybe try to reflect on this, is climate migration a major global problem? And if so, what kind of a problem is it? Some will say it's a myth. Others will say it portends major catastrophe. But it is a contested concept, so how should it be addressed? It's a problematical concept, but on the other hand, in some way, the problem won't entirely be gotten rid of. Now, in this talk, I want to offer a critical and sociological perspective on a contested concept, not, I hasten to add, with a view to dismissing it, but in order to understand it better. So, in essence, climate change is clear. Climate change is a clear fact about the world in which we live in, but the problem is climate migration is not quite so clear. How should the relationship between climate change and migration be understood? And, well, I will come to it more by way of conclusion, but I also want to suggest, is migration really the solution to rising sea levels? The main consequence of climate change for this purpose is rising sea levels. So is migration really the solution? And much of the debate today, it's a debate largely about numbers, and it's a debate about whether climate migration, if that can be pinned down, is either a good or a bad thing. But I want to question those presuppositions. Okay, so those are some questions. There's probably at least two questions there for maybe to help a debate get going later. Yeah, now, it's clear that climate change is a relatively new notion, as is climate migration, or newer still, climate refugees. The notion of environmental refugees goes back quite a number of decades to the mid-1980s, and that certainly preceded the current concern with climate change, since it was not really connected with catastrophic global climate change, even though it was already underway, but there wasn't widespread consciousness of it. It was more connected with more local environmental problems. By the late 80s, already climate migration was taking on a security dimension. So that leads to the suspicion, but only the suspicion, that it may be a product of the security discourse, in part, I think, not entirely. Last month, well, not quite last month, earlier this month, in February, no, let me correct that, February of last year, US President Biden signed an executive order directing a national security advisor to prepare a report, which has since come out on climate change and its impact on migration. It's interesting to note that this problem is seen as a matter of national security in the US, even though the conclusion, not an unintelligent report, that much of climate migration is actually internal, national. Now, without too quickly trying to answer this question, I don't think I can anyway, I think we can say the new concern with climate change around global warming has repositioned the older question of environmental migration as a wider and more global problem of a rise in stateless persons, a new mass phenomenon. In 1990, it was already predicted by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, a well-known prediction now that some 200 million climate migrants will be in the world by the middle of this century. A few years ago, in 2018, the World Bank estimated that 3 world regions, the Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, and Latin America, will generate 143 million climate refugees by the middle of this century. And last year, the figure by the World Bank, at least, was increased to 216 million. The figures vary, but they tend to be around the mark of 200 million by mid-century. The United Nations High Commission on Refugees has been more constrained. They've predicted 21.5 million. That was quite a few years ago, 2016, were affected by sudden onset climate change. Now, it's clear that around about 400 million people in the world will be living in areas less than 2 meters above sea level and at risk from sea level rises unless global emissions are reduced. But that doesn't seem very, very likely. And a report published in Nature, I think in the last few months, which is based on interviews with experts on climate change and rising sea levels, have more or less confirmed that by the end of the century, there'll be a 1 meter sea level rise. And that's assuming zero population growth. Now, that's all in the context of world population increasing to more than 9 billion by the middle of the century, and close to 11 by the end of the century. It's now just about, figures disputed, almost 8 billion. By the end of the year, it seems it's going to be 8 billion, with much of the increase in low to middle income countries. Much of the affected populations live in coastal areas. And over the past 30 years, there has been a huge increase in the number of people living in coastal areas throughout the world. And I think very important, in these areas, there is almost everywhere uncontrolled development taking place. It seems to be the case that there are more people displaced by climate change than by civil war. One estimate that I've read is as many as 3 times. However, this will change as more parts of the world become at risk of rising sea levels. Florida, for example, is one such example, and it's possible to imagine the disappearance of Miami by the end of the century, according to Jeff Goodwell, in a book published about 5 years ago. We now have notions of eco-refugees, ecological or climate migrants, so a discursive shift has occurred. But with this is much uncertainty. There are many terms here, migrant, refugee, here indicating that they do not necessarily have fixed reference. Are they products of a particular discourse? Am I, for example, I actually live in Barcelona. Am I a refugee fleeing from Brexit Britain, or just a plain migrant? Brits, I'm not actually British, though I'm a British citizen, actually from Ireland. But I know Brits are mostly retirees in Spain, one of the largest migrant groups in Europe. They call themselves expats. Anyway, there's also a problem in using the term refugee in this context, since the term refugee is a legal term to refer to people escaping political oppression or persecution. Although the term climate refugee is often used in relation to forced migration in the context of climate and environmental change, it's not a legally recognized term. The 1951 Refugee Convention does not recognize environmental factors as criteria to define a refugee, a term that remains political in the sense of fleeing from persecution. We can change it, but of course that's shall we say, the official position. The UNHCR says the term climate refugee is not endorsed by them, and it's more accurate to refer to, I quote here from a document, persons displaced in the context of disasters and climate change. The notion of the environment as embodying the planet has also acquired a new meaning in recent times with the rise of the idea of the Anthropocene and human-induced climate change. Yet many questions remain as regards the status of the concept of climate migration. Not all policy literature is unnuanced. UNHCR document notes, I quote, while not in themselves causes of refugee movements, climate, environmental degradation, and natural disasters increasingly interact with the drivers of refugee movements. So there's an important sociological insight there, the word interact with other things. The environment and the movement of population has always been seen as central to human societies, in historical and geographical research. That it might not be so makes no sense. It's not possible to conceive of societies separate from the natural world, which provides them with their resources, shelter, and energy. Its relatively new meaning as a cause of a new kind of migration does not sit easily with a longer historical perspective. Perhaps Western societies have got used to the illusion that they have escaped from nature. But let's begin with climate change in relation to population migration and establish some facts. The objective conditions resulting from climate change today include droughts, desertification, rising sea levels, I think the most important, more frequent cyclones, wildfires, flooding of rivers from increased rain or melting of glaciers, salinization of agricultural lands. Now, all these factors hinder the supply of fresh water and the production of food, aside from making land inhabitable. In all of these, the supply of fresh water is key, perhaps more so than rising sea levels in terms of the realities of people's lives. But nonetheless, rising sea levels are the most consequential worldwide and often the cause of the contamination of fresh water. with the discussion today about global warming, we must, the Earth warming, we must not forget that, just over 70%, 71 I think, of the Earth's surface is covered by the seas. So what's going on in the seas is really very, very important. Global mean sea level has risen 21 centimeters since the beginning of the 20th century. As the surface of the Earth is not flat, I think we know that, so too sea levels are not uniform. Local levels vary. As the oceans heat, water expands and contributes to the melting of the polar ice cap, quite aside from other factors leading to the melting of glaciers. The Mediterranean, like everywhere, is at risk too, especially in relation to the ancient civilizations that were founded in low areas near the sea. For some reason, the eastern Mediterranean is experiencing higher sea level rises. Some 15 cities are at risk of serious flooding. The northern Baltic Sea has much lower rates of sea level rise, just to illustrate that diversity. But that may be due to land, slight rise in land level in that area. Now, I don't want to talk about the tropicalization of the Mediterranean, which is heating higher than the global average, I understand. It is perhaps worth noting that at risk too will be many airports which are close to the sea, an interesting possible consequence of rising sea levels. Well, there may be no harm if many airports are shut down. So what is then new about environment and migration today? Is it not the case that populations have always been influenced by the environment? Etienne Piquet, who I think was a speaker here recently, has commented that it challenges the economic model that dominates migration studies, the view that people migrate for economic reasons. The environment has tended to have been absent in much of migration research, and its return today has not been unconnected. Unfortunately, maybe it's not the reason to connect it, but with enormous scenarios of catastrophe. How to avoid this? We need to recognize the significance of climate change for migration and everything else for that matter. But if it's dominated by alarmist discourses, no useful purpose will be served. And how to avoid natural determinism, that is a deterministic view of the relation between climate change and migration when it comes to the complex field of human migration, of human movement. At least three things come together when we talk about climate change and migration. Climate change, migration, and change more generally. Of course, two politics which pervade everything and is therefore not separate. That is a point to begin, how to talk about something when something else is part of it. This is the sociological and conceptual problem with climate migration. It is a construction. This is not a problem, this is a problem not just with regard to climate migration, but concerns the notion of migration itself. It is also a problem in all sociological analysis, when one thing is part of another, and nothing is self-contained. It's very hard to find social phenomena that are somehow self-contained. Part of the solution of this conceptual or theoretical problem is in the great sociological tradition of Max Weber, to see all social phenomena through the lens of concepts and not as external or fixed reference. As such, they require interpretation, but going beyond Weber, of critique too. Now, to say that climate migration is a construction is perhaps not in itself controversial, for as I said, all social phenomena need to be conceptually or theoretically constructed. The question is, what does it mean to say it is a construction? Here are two perspectives. The first is, we have the specter of catastrophe. It is often exaggerated, but it could be said that a philosophy and a politics of catastrophe is needed for meaningful political action to take place. And it's currently absent in mainstream politics, except perhaps as an oppositional movement. So we have a catastrophic view on climate migration, as well as on climate change more generally. The spectre of failed states with rising sea levels haunts the political imagination. The melting, perhaps you've read about it recently, the melting of the giant Thwaite glacier in the Antarctica is a recent and striking example. It's the size of Britain and contains enough water to raise sea levels by more than half a metre. It's now melting rapidly and will speed up melting that is already underway. This is fact, but its significance resides in the meaning that is attributed to it. The catastrophic imagination is also present in some responses to infectious diseases. An example, too, is eco-anxiety amongst young people. Climate migration as a new mass phenomenon may be an imaginary, not a real objective fact. Images of massive numbers of people coming from the global south can fuel xenophobia. It feeds on the imagination of catastrophe, fueled by visions of the end of the world. It's in the film Don't Look Up, if you've seen that film. So that is one perspective. On the other side, second perspective, is a view based on sustainability or control that a potential catastrophe can be averted. For reasons of time, I won't expand on the sustainability perspective right now, but I'll come back to it in the end by way of conclusion. Both of these positions are pitted against growth models, business as usual. Now, all seem to share the assumption of stability as the normal state of affairs. I suggest this is one of the things that needs to be questioned. Such questioning also points towards a critical view of climate migration, or at least a question of the presumptions underlying it. These assumptions exaggerate the specter of catastrophe, of migration, not of climate change, but the specter of catastrophic migration, and do not really do enough to understand the new politics of the Anthropocene. It can be a foil for emergency governance and biopolitical securitization. Going back to my initial point about security as one dominant frame in which climate migration is posed. Much of it is a continuation of neoliberal politics that seeks to restrict democracy, as in, for example, a position advocating resilience in face of supposedly deterministic forces. In fact, all these forces are political, and they're not just technocratic and managerial. It is a case of it's often a case of not letting a good crisis go unused. This is one focus for research, then the political instrumentalization of climate migration, which functions as a signifier in a discourse, the discourse of securitization. But what would a more specifically sociological account offer that's different from mainstream approaches, and also ones that just only look at discourses? I think it's not enough. The discursive analysis of the construction of discourses is surely, without a doubt, one fruitful avenue of research along the lines I've just indicated. But I think a sociological approach would go beyond discourse analysis. It would stress non-deterministic forces and social context and, well, quintessentially sociological agency and power. It would also entail analysis that's not based only on numbers. Estimates vary hugely, and there are, maximalists and minimalists in the debate. And I think the minimalists have basically won this debate. As a conclusion that I think I can reasonably draw from the literature. And in any case, the debate about numbers is not a debate that a sociologist is going to win. I think I can accept the lower end of the estimates, not the well-known ones of Norman Maier, 2007, his estimate of 200 million environmental refugees. Some of these have been scaled back anyway. There are big differences in these estimates, as well in the timescales, which is quite important. A sociological account would place greater emphasis on agency Migrants are agents, not passive subjects on which external forces act on them. A sociological account, as I mentioned, would question the assumption too of stability as the normal condition of society. Missing from the mainstream accounts is some sense of mediation. By that I mean that climate change, which is an objective fact about the world, like all natural environmental factors, is mediated in human societies through a range of social, cultural, economic and political processes. It's therefore multi-dimensional and multi-linear. Again, I emphasize, I'm not denying that climate change has consequences for migration, of course it has, but I'm questioning the assumption that this takes a specific form and can be analyzed exclusively using predictive models that are generally foretelling catastrophe. To be clear, climate change is real and incontrovertible. Sea level rises, a consequence of climate change, is occurring. Drought, land degradation is happening as a result of climate change, i.e. global warming. Now, the second step that this leads to population movement is more difficult to establish except in certain limited cases. A very basic issue is that migration is entangled in many processes, in social, economic, political, such that it cannot be easily separated from social context. Perhaps it can't be separated at all. It follows then that there's not a clear-cut category such as climate migrants or climate refugees as a term that can be really generalized. It must be qualified that this does not mean that there cannot be a direct relation between an ecological disaster and migration. There are many examples of this. For example, as a result of an earthquake or a volcanic eruption or a tsunami where people have to be evacuated. However, note that these are not examples of climate change and have nothing to do with anthropogenic activity. The relation between climate change and migration, in most cases, is graduated and therefore by definition only evident in the longer time frame, which makes measurements more difficult. Of course, while there are a few examples of a direct relation, one must say the case of the Pacific Islands stands out. Their sea levels are rising much faster. Many islands have disappeared, and many more are destined to do so, and yet others will lose considerable ground. The Federated States of Micronesia are much reduced in size, and fresh water supplies are contaminated by seawater. Something like 2.5 million people cover around about 11 island countries. It's a relatively small number of people. There are, of course, other Pacific islands, notably the Marshall Islands, that are also threatened by rising sea levels. These islands are, of course, easily endangered due to factors nothing to do with climate change, such as the recent volcano that led to a tsunami in Tonga in January of this year. Perhaps more pertinent is Bangladesh, a very large population of 165 million, or a third live on the southern coast, which is just above sea level. During the rainy season, about a fifth of the country can be flooded. It's been estimated that 17% of the country may be submerged by the middle of this century. There's nothing new about flooding in Southeast Asia, but climate change has brought a new dimension to it, with ever larger numbers of people displaced. Other countries affected are India, Philippines, Vietnam, China, and, of course, very importantly, the United States. Mozambique is now the most vulnerable African country. However, interestingly, the largest number of potential climate refugees, not surprisingly, are in China. I think it can be safely said, if they migrate, it will be, as is generally the case in China, internal migration. Also, climatic factors can intersect with other events, such as political events, such as a war or terrorist organizations leading to a flood crisis or a pandemic, for example. some of the most vulnerable societies to climate change have experienced civil war. Disentangling climate migration from these events and process is difficult. It may be the case that the problem, in relation to climate migration that is less climate change than political forces. If so, this would suggest that climate migration could be a form of depoliticization, but it can be a form of politicization. A recent article in the Journal of Peace Research, Kobe et al., talks about individuals uprooted by climate change are more likely to become involved in social movements for migrant rights, though the article strangely associates this with social order. The point is that when an event occurs, an ecological disaster, such as an ecological disaster, there are many different responses, many different human responses, and these are always conditioned by the specific context. People may stay, they may have no choice but to stay, they may stay and adapt, or they may fail to adapt, they will suffer great pain, they may move to a nearby place, short distance migration, or they may embark on long distance or international migration, which may be successful or it may not be. Overall, internal national migration probably accounts for most migration. Well, not probably, certainly the World Bank has recently estimated in a report that I've read by 2030, the vast majority of climate migrants, around about 200 million, will be internal migrants. Most are caused by storms damaging housing and multiple seasons of crop failure due to seawater infiltrating fresh water. And there are gender patterns too, as well as age. Migration may be temporary, recurrent, or permanent. Migration is selective. Yet, in all of this, one point stands out. To the extent to which the environment, climate, plays a role in migration, it's more likely to impact on local and national contexts than national, international. Yet the dominant image is of global population movements. Here we can recall the famous, not a great deal of research on historical examples of climate migration. The most famous one must be the Dust Bowl migration in the United States of America from Oklahoma in the 1930s. Recent ones, the Hurricane Katrina 2005 displaced 1 million people. And last year, the last year and a half, wildfires led to the displacement of another 1 million people in the United States, and that's quite clearly related to climate change. Responses are also mediated by the political context of the state and its capacity to intervene. Some states, more than others, have the capacity to counteract rising sea levels. Okay, they don't have maybe quite the same capacity to counteract climate change more generally, but the more specific issue of rising sea levels, as in parts of Southern California, through sustainable development measures. As has been much recognized, especially by sociologists, and here I refer to the work of Thomas Faest, German migration scholar that you're undoubtedly familiar with. Population displacement is related to inequality. The poor do not generally move far, or maybe they never move, nor necessarily do the wealthy, who are less likely to be living in danger zones. In general, those who have something to gain move. That's true generally of political agitation in history. Those who have something to gain do something, as opposed to those who haven't really something to gain. This is also the case with environmentally induced migration. It's entangled simply in social and economic and political factors. Also, migration is not necessarily a whole-scale movement. Not all members of a household, for example, move together. Against the specter of catastrophe, let's not make any misunderstanding here. Climate change is catastrophic. But as regards the specter of migration catastrophe, much of climate change is gradual. and thus population movement is, when it occurs, gradual. There can be slow developing or multiple onset events or rapid onset events. Thomas Feist has interestingly suggested that the question could also be reversed, namely why so few people move. That's an interesting way to look at the problem. The work of the sociologist Zygmunt Bauman is interested in this in this context too. He's also stressed the immobility of large numbers of people in a book, now quite an old book, in Globalization, The Human Consequences in 1998. Yeah, so I'm referring here to Feist's capacity, capability, is sort of one side of the coin, and the other is vulnerability. So some people have greater capacity to move, but they may not be the most vulnerable. So migration is very often tied to a prior capacity for mobility. If one is not mobile, migration is likely to be limited or not possible. In one sense, migration is in many ways a redundant term in a world in which mobility is the basis of everything. But we must not lose sight of the fact that many people are not mobile, as I've just been saying, at least not internationally mobile. But of course, in the longer perspective of history, as I said, humans have always been migratory. It was a normal condition before the arrival of the territorial state, which established a certain groundness or fixity to populations, which is today being unraveled. Stability can come from movement. In fact, it does come from movement. It doesn't necessarily precede it in the longer perspective of history. It's also evident that population movement in history has been linked to climate change. It was intrinsic to the early formation of states and empires. Mike Davis, American sociologist in California, in a book, Late Victorian Holocausts, El Nino famines and the making of the Third World in 2002, showed how social and economic factors in the 19th century were related to climate change then, which was also linked to colonialism. In many cases, climate change should be seen as an influence rather than necessarily a cause, since human migration is interwoven with so many other factors. The relation between the human and the inhuman, the social and the natural, is a complex relationship, but for sure an unstable one. There are important distinctions to be made in the logic of explanation based on causal analysis. As a sociologist, I'm interested in explanation and being able to explain things. We can't avoid causes. For example, distinguishing here between preconditions and influences. And there's also adaptive behavior. Then there's the conjunction of causes. And I think a lot of explanation today has to involve in some way the conjunction of causes, of different causes, multi-causality. This brings me to adaptation, migration as adaptation, a major theme in migration research. McLennan and Smith, in a 2006 article, talk about vulnerability, risk, adaptive capacity, and migration. Migration, by them, is theorized as possible adaptive response to risks associated with climate change. Yeah, sure, it offers an interesting alternative to monocausal accounts or simply associative reasoning, deterministic accounts. But nonetheless, it's not really a sufficiently critical approach, as it doesn't question the objective causes of climate change and environmental risk that create the context for migration, essentially repositioning the poor in the global labor market. They have to simply adapt. In this view, the dislocated poor are migrants who just adapt to wherever they're forced to go, if they can go anywhere. So, yeah, sure, it's less deterministic, but perhaps uncritical of the demands of global capitalism, which in many ways creates the conditions for migration. Critical approaches to migration and climate change are now much more critical of of policy-driven approaches that seek to estimate numbers. Migrants may be vulnerable, but that cannot be their chief characteristic leading to their movement, to their migration. The dominant view of migration as deterministic persists. Push factors supposedly explain it. Environmental degradation, depletion of natural resources, etc., supposedly compels migration, which is generally detrimental. This can be Malthusian and reductionist, and linked to, as I said, though not always, but security issues are always there, global security crisis. This kind of mainstream position is driven by the vision of the ungovernable poor, challenging the authority of global elites. And it feeds into neoliberal, depoliticized views of the global south, where these people are supposedly going to come from. And, well, the dangers and resources for global labor supply. A very interesting volume edited by Brown and Bettini, Life Adrift, 2017, is a very good discussion of some of these issues. Yeah, now this whole perspective is embedded in positivistic conceptions of science that are essentially predictive as well as reductive. Some of these predictions have their place for sure. The solution is not just to take a minimalist approach in terms of numbers, which is often the corrective of some of the more exaggerated predictions. The problem with research on migration is that migration is multi-causal. Migration research and environmental research seems to have become divorced or be divorced from sociological analysis, which places, sociological analysis, places a strong emphasis on multi-causality as well as on agency. So it can be two-way with migrants who are social actors acting back on the social circumstances of their situation. There's the related danger of separating the category of environment from social context. Even catastrophes are mostly human-made, as is widely recognized by disaster research. It's clear that the devastation caused by Hurricane Katrina in 2005 and the subsequent displacement of people was related to social and political conditions. I think a very clear example of that. Much of climate change-induced population displacement is not confined to the global south. Tornadoes and storms, river flooding, fires all cause major movement of people in the Western world as well, recently in Germany and in the United States, and in Australia. From a critical and methodological perspective, to assert a contextual factor, climate change, is not necessarily to attribute causality. We must be careful with going too quickly to causality. According to Weber, causal explanation is a final sort of explanation. And in many cases, it may not be possible to reach it, according to Weber in his famous arguments about the methodology of the social sciences. For this reason, much of sociological explanation remains on the level of showing how two more things combine. But causal analysis can be possible, but it can't be too quickly followed from relating to different things. We should also be more critical of imaginaries of catastrophe. The work of Gerard Delante was in his famous Collapse book in 2005. A great, fascinating book, but all for the wrong reasons. It did much to fuel this approach and led to a new interest in theories of societal collapse. It was based on the erroneous view of pre-modern, archaic societies as determined by nature, and how, in many cases, they got the balance wrong, and as a result, they perished. This perspective has been recently demolished as far as pre-modern societies are concerned, because it was based on monocausal explanations. The volume Questioning Collapse is pretty much demolished Gerard Dalante's work. It's perhaps more relevant for contemporary societies. I refer here to Serving and Stephen's excellent book, How Everything Can Collapse, published by Polity Press 2020. I would suggest that much of the discussion around climate refugees and climate migration, whatever term you want to take here, requires a critical interpretive approach. It consists of discourses, narratives, and imaginaries. These discourses have a tendency to depoliticize both migrants, migration more generally, as well as climate change, as simply an objective condition that happens and for which the solution is some mix of scientific prediction, global security, or humanitarianism to contain the phenomenon. Of course, such scenarios are related to the global south and characterize the north-south relationship. The concern with climate refugees coincided with the refugee crisis in Europe in the past 6-7 years and have amplified it. Returning to climate change in the context of the environment, we need to denaturalize the environment, to see it as embedded in human societies and not external. The solutions are not just technocratic ones concerning control, of course that's important, but also democratic. I would like to argue that migration, and specifically climate migration, be located within the broader perspective of major social transformation. It is not a phenomenon in itself that's separate from other social and political processes. There's a need for both interpretive and explanatory accounts. The interpretive does not help really with quantitative questions, which also, of course, do need to be answered. To be clear, I'm not opposed to these predictive approaches. Some groundbreaking research is being done on modeling sea level rise and the geography of populations, as well as methods to protect areas of risk. But there are wider questions that need answering. For example, a major question for political philosophy and international law is what happens to the sovereignty of a state that disappears or loses territory to the sea. Does it still exist if a state disappears? Statehood is based on a defined territory, and its loss will surely be a problem. But then, is it lost if it is submerged? The World Bank has produced a new report, Legal Dimensions of Sea Level Rise, in which some of these issues are discussed. Let me draw some conclusions. I think I've already exceeded my time. Can I quickly draw some conclusions? Climate change climate migration, I want to say, is contested. Climate change is not. Let me just put it boldly like that. Climate migration is contested. As a phenomenon, it's multifaceted, which makes it difficult to really pin down. From a normative perspective, the problem is not migration as something to be controlled, but identifying its multiple causes. The environment and climate change shouldn't be depoliticized. Explanatory accounts based on numbers are problematical. Interpretive approaches, typical sociological approaches, offer more valuable and different insights, even if they do not account for the prevalence or the extent of climate migration, which is generally a problem with interpretive approaches, which, avoiding the problems of quantitative and explanatory approaches do not necessarily have much that is useful to say about objective processes and depth structures. But nonetheless, we need both explanatory and interpretive. The figure of the climate migrant in many ways captures the defining problem of our time, namely climate change and the need for radical ecopolitics. The climate migrant expresses a strong sense of a loss of home, not just a place to live in, but its disappearance, as in the examples I gave from the Southern Pacific. It certainly represents a major shift beyond modernity, which in many ways was about the conquest of land and the mastery of the sea, as in, famously Schmidt's Nomas Terrare, the mapping of the seas, while today the seas are conquering the land in a reversal, is it not, of the logic of modernity? But looking beyond the end of the century, Europe may itself become inhabitable when the polar ice cap melts and the Gulf Stream shuts down. But I don't want to fall into catastrophic thinking. Well, maybe not quite. Catastrophe thinking needs to be has its place. It needs to be connected to the political imagination. I think if we have a vision of catastrophe, as in that example of the firm I referred to, perhaps some of you have seen, Don't Look Up. Yeah, it has its place, but only if it's connected to the political imagination. The longer view is necessary. In view of the objective reality of climate change and rising sea levels, many parts of the world will have to live with rising sea levels, including the Mediterranean. Even if by some political miracle, if global warming is reduced or brought under control, the seas will continue to rise by perhaps up to 1 meter, which is a lot for many parts of the world. This raises some interesting challenges. There's a dilemma of sustainable development in coastal areas at risk as opposed to uncontrollable development versus facing the consequences, which will include migration from these areas, which include the developed world. Maybe somewhat controversially, would want to suggest that perhaps migration is not a solution. Other solutions need to be found. Since sea level rising is not just going to stop, even if climate change is somehow arrested or brought under control, sea level rise will continue. So it's imperative that solutions other than migration be found. In the past, major experiments were found with rising sea levels, which weren't caused by human-induced climate change. For sure, we can think of the example of Venice and the Netherlands, which has been working with land reclamation for centuries, and recently China and other countries in Asia have embarked on such ventures of land reclamation. Perhaps more thinking in this direction is needed rather than simply accepting the necessity for global migration, because that really falls into the trap of determinism, that climate change is happening, the seas are going to rise, so we simply have to accept the fact of climate migration. So perhaps a lot more can be done of a productive nature. But that involves politicizing issues that until now are not necessarily politicized, including politicizing ever more climate change. And with that, I'll stop. I think I've exceeded my time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Gerard, for a very enlightening presentation. And now I would like to open the floor for questions or comments that you have for our guest speaker. So, if that's okay, we can collect some questions.
I have one question with respect to... My question is that with respect to the entanglement of climate migration with respect to economic migration. So you mentioned it at the beginning of your presentation at some point.
Is it now?
Yes.
Okay. So my question is about the entanglement of economic migration with the climate change migration, because you touched upon it at the beginning of your presentation. And if you look at the data, can we, is there an evidence or it kind of an indication that if we look at if climate migration is challenging the economic theory of migration, then is there a class component to it? Because you mentioned the example of Bangladesh, and in Bangladesh, when in south where the towns are flooding and people are shifting to Dhaka, Dhaka by itself is facing the climate issues. But for people who are shifting, it's a better economic prospect that they are accepting and shifting to Dhaka instead of shifting to somewhere else. Whereas if there are climate-induced migration in Europe, and people don't have to really care about economic factors, then you could see it's more of a climate migration which is dominating and not the economic migration. So is there an interplay between these two concepts? And if you could a little bit elaborate upon that.
I think that's Sharon, a really interesting question and perspective to raise. Of course, they are connected in the sense, well, everything is connected. But I think it's fair to say that up to now, economic migration is sure the dominant factor in migration, at least in relatively less well-off countries, let's put it like that, and not climate migration. I think that climate migration is yet to occur. I'm not sure that there's significant climate migration going on in the world, but it must be the case that climate migration, by definition, is also economic migration. That it would be difficult to find examples of climate migration that's not economic. That even if you take examples that perhaps are yet to occur in the so-called developed world, let's just say potential migration from wealthy areas, that will also necessarily be economic migration. So perhaps the question then really is, which is the primary factor? I guess what we are looking at, and though I'm skeptical of, as many critics are, of the more exaggerated scenarios, but of course, by century's end, this will be probably one of the major forces. So I think they are separate, though entangled. To say that something is entangled, to say that A is entangled in B, logically doesn't preclude saying that A and B are separate. So I think Bangladesh, from what I've got real expertise in Bangladesh, but from what I've been reading, and it's up there in the front of discussions about potential climate migration. Refer to a few facts, I guess you probably knew more about it. That's there, it's going to be, the push factor there probably will be climate migration. But it might quite well be internal as opposed to international.
More questions? Comments?
It's working? Yeah. Thank you, sir, for your presentation. I would like to point that you were mentioning that a possible way of research, a possible topic of research could be the political instrumentalization of climate migration. And I was really interested on this idea, and I don't know if you can point and go any further on that, or if you can point any current or past practice that we have already seen about political instrumentalization of this type of migration, actually. Thank you so much.
Yeah, sure. In researching the topic, I was struck by some of the most interesting writing on migration, on climate migration. Does take this approach. I refer to an author, Bettini, but I have a written version of this paper, which will have a long form and a short form. The short form will be published by the Institute. I'll hopefully have the references in it, or happy to send them out. But anyway, the dominant, most interesting approach at the moment seems to be in what at least sociology would be called an interpretive or a discourse approach, and analyzing the discourses that are emerging around climate change, and broadly taking a critical approach to those discourses, because they exaggerate the extent of the issue, the assumptions made about migrants, the issues around security, neoliberal views about the global labour supply and all of that. No, I think that's all great, and it's typical sociological research from an interpretive perspective, but maybe more explanatory approaches are needed that also politicize the causal factors, because it doesn't really address the causal factors. And it seems from totally the other side of the equation altogether, you have these more quantitative approaches that are basically predictive models. There's nothing in between. I think personally as a sociologist interested in both explanatory and interpretive approaches, that you need both. But maybe I've slightly forgotten what your question is. But I think, interpretive approaches get you so far by identifying the discourses. But what happens in the end is that nothing useful is really said about migration and about potential migration, because the objective problems exist. So climate change, global warming is going to continue, hopefully. Not the way that it might be going. And whatever happens with climate change, the seas are going to rise. So some solutions need to be found. And that might involve, questioning the good of migration, because there's this view that let's call it the security imaginary sees migration as a problem. Let's put it simply like that, even if it's out of proportion, and even if the reality of climate migration is that it's going to be internal anyway. So there's that. There's that position, and the result of critical discourse type analysis is that migration is, kind of deconstructed, but ultimately nothing useful is said about the reality of migration, because some migration as a result of rising sea level will happen. So in my view, social scientists need to also be, looking at it, and also these critical approaches are dismissive. Maybe I'm jumping beyond your question. Actually, I discussed my paper with a colleague who said you're too reliant on sustainable development here, because the upshot of my argument is that some kind of sustainable development in coastal areas is necessary in order to find viable medium-term, if not long-term, solutions to rising sea levels. And there are some examples of the world where that's going on. But there's a strong view out there that sustainable development is not a solution for climate change. And of course it's not, but it could be a solution for rising sea levels, which is one consequence of climate change. And for that reason, I'm a little skeptical of the ultimate usefulness of discourse interpretive approaches. How about, maybe that sounds a bit convoluted, but I want to bring in the need for actually solving problems and not just deconstructing discourses, which is what, I know not all of you are sociologists, but what sociologists like to do, to see neoliberalism lurking everywhere. Whether it is or not, it's not going to solve the problem of rising sea levels. We may not solve the problem of rising sea levels, but you can hopefully solve some of the social problems resulting from them. In other words, politicizing issues, and of course politicizing the objective causal factors of climate change itself and global warming. That's the ultimate big causal factor, the driver of everything. And not seeing the migrant as passive agent, or simply a product of discourses.
More questions, comments?
Refutations?
Gerard, I have a question, which is related to this. I mean, I think that this idea of this, I mean, this, the politicization of climate migration, I find it quite interesting in your talk. However, I was wondering how to bring this, I mean, this centering climate migration into the political debate at a more global scale. I'm thinking about the recent global compacts of migration and refugees, which are like a starting point towards the construction of this elusive global governance of migration. However, I'm wondering how to reconcile these efforts with, I mean, the idea that you're bringing to the table of actually politicizing climate migration.
Yeah, well, thanks for asking that. It's in this talk, I didn't bring in my own meta-normative position other than raising critical questions and the need to repoliticize domains that are not really politicized. But going beyond that, you know, if I were to give another talk, maybe go into the sphere of social political theory, a topic on which I have spent a lot of time working on in the last, I don't know, 10, 15 years, is on cosmopolitanism and cosmopolitics. And yeah, I suppose my response is that what's needed, and well, in part it's there, is cosmopolitics as a cosmopolitan political, not just cosmopolitanism in some loose sense that, you know, the world is all connected. Sure it is, but more of a cosmopolitical response, as opposed to ones that remain on the level of policies of sustainable development, which I think are important, sustainable development, as opposed to uncontrollable development. But that's not ultimately a solution on a global level. I think that something much more needs to go on. There's, you know, one consequence of climate migration, maybe not yet, but perhaps it's already starting, is, you know, questions around territorial rights. And yeah, I raised at the end you know, this whole question of when a state disappears. So far, I don't think even one of the smaller states, Micronesia, has disappeared, but for sure in the next decades, some states in the world are going to disappear. Well, that's of course the question. What does that mean? Will they, because their territory disappears underneath the sea, does that mean that those states will necessarily disappear? So there are, you know, the answers, I don't have the answers to this question. It requires, you know, challenging legal and political expertise, but that would be an interesting problem that can only be addressed from a cosmopolitan perspective, that fundamentally challenges the traditional assumptions underlying the sovereignty of states. This idea of, you know, of territory, of course, we're seeing that be played out today in a different context. You know, questioning some of the received notions about rights and of territory, the received notions of sovereignty. Yeah. Well, I've written, perhaps you know, extensively on cosmopolitan social and political philosophy, and I think we would have to go into that sphere and just beyond some of the more direct consequences of climate migration and climate change. But ultimately, climate change, which is the driver of all of these things at the end of the day, and rising sea levels, is by its nature global. So that would suggest the need for cosmopolitics.
Thank you. More questions, comments? Okay, if no one else has any more questions, I suggest giving a round of applause to our speaker. Thank you very much, Gerard, for accepting our invitation again.
Oh, it's a pleasure.
And thank you all for coming today to IEMed. And also thank you to IEMed for hosting us today and organizing this seminar. So have everyone a nice evening and see you soon. Oh yes, it's very much.
What you were looking for. Yeah, it's a great topic.
Yes.